I.H. Bauman, 1936. H. Methodology and African Prehistory. Passing on the tradition. Even if this is not the case, arrangements of the recitals are found, which go so far as to clothe traditions having a specific content in the uniform of current artistic standards. For example, in narratives, the series of episodes leading towards the climax form the main plot, whereas others constitute sophisticated parallel repetitions or are only transitions from one stage of the narrative to another. As a general rule, it can be assumed that the more the recital conforms to the standard model of excellence and the more it is admired by the public, the more it is distorted. In a series of variants, the correct variant can sometimes be discerned from the fact that it runs counter to these standards, just as a variant which contradicts the social function of a tradition is more likely to be true than the others. It should not, however, be forgotten that not all oral composers are perfect. There are some bad ones and their variants will always be sorry affairs. But the attitude of the public, like the setting of a performance, is not exclusively an artistic event. It is above all a social event, and this obliges us to consider tradition in its social environment. The social framework of tradition, everything a society considers important for the smooth running of its institutions, for a correct understanding of the various social grades and their accompanying roles, for everyone's rights and obligations, is carefully transmitted. In an oral society this is done by tradition, whereas in a society which keeps records in writing, only the least important memories are left to tradition. It is this fact which for a long time led historians who came from literate societies to believe, erroneously, that traditions were some sort of fairy tale, lullaby or children's game. Every social institution and every social group also has its own identity accompanied by past embodied in collective performances of a tradition which describes and justifies it. For this reason, every tradition will have its social surface, to borrow the expression used by H. Monnier. Without a social surface the tradition would no longer be transmitted and, having no function, would lose its reason for existence and be abandoned by the institution underpinning it. One might be tempted to follow the lead of some scholars who thought that the nature or profile of a given society's corpus of historical traditions could be deduced in advance on the basis of a classification of collectivities into types, such as states, stateless societies, and so on. Although it is true that the various African societies can be roughly classified under such model headings, it can easily be shown that these types can be split up into an infinite number of subdivisions, because each society is different and the criteria used are arbitrary and limited. Then no two states are identical or even similar in detail. There are vast differences between the organizational framework of the Masai Kenya Tanzania Mbu Kenya Mbu Kenya and Gala Kenya Ethiopia societies, even though they can all be classified. 148. Oral tradition and its methodology. As age group societies and are situated in the same part of Africa. If we wish to take a case of a so-called simple stateless society composed of small groups based on a multiplicity of families, we might think that the Guro Ivory Coast would be a good example. We expect to find a profile of traditions containing only stories of descent and genealogy. We do find them. But we discover also an esoteric history handed down by a secret society. In the case of the Tonga of Zambia, we again find the story of descent, but also stories of ritual centers run by the rainmakers. Not a single society of this type fails to show us an unexpected major institution. The states. The extreme case is certainly that of the kingdom of the Texio, where the royal tradition does not go back further than 2 generations, although kingdoms are supposed to have very long-standing traditions. Moreover, we can follow the tradition of the magic symbols of the nobles much further back than can that of the royal symbol. Hasty generalizations on the value of traditions, the tendency to oversimplify which is still all too prevalent, are completely unwarranted. The profile of a given body of traditions can be determined only a posteriori. It is evident that the functions fulfilled by traditions tend to distort them. It is impossible to draw up a complete list of these functions, partly because a tradition can perform several different functions and can play a role running from the well-defined to the vague in relation to them, but mainly because the word function is itself confusing. It is most often used to describe everything which serves to strengthen or maintain the institution upon which it depends. As the connection is not tangible, The imagination can produce an endless list of functions to be performed and no choice is possible. It is, however, quite easy to distinguish certain precise purposes, manifest or latent, fulfilled by some traditions. For example, there are those mythical charters, those histories of dynasties, genealogies, lists of kings which may be considered as being nothing less than unwritten constitutions. We can extend this category by including in it all traditions connected with public legal matters, for example, those which support public rights to property. They are usually official traditions inasmuch as they claim universal validity for the society. Private traditions, associated with groups or institutions embodied in others, will be less well preserved because they are less important, but often more true to fact than the others. It should, however, be pointed out that private traditions are official for the group which transmits them. Thus, the family history is private as compared with the history of a whole state, and what it says about the state is less subject to control by the state than an official public tradition. But, within the family itself, the private tradition becomes official. For all purposes connected with the family it should therefore be treated as such. We can accordingly see why it is so helpful to use family or local histories to clarify points of general political history. Their testimony is less subject to distortion and can offer an effective check on the assertions made by official traditions. On the other hand, as they concern only subgroups, their transmission is often lacking in 149. Methodology and African prehistory. Care and depth, as can be seen from the numerous variants which usually exist. Bmong other COMMON functions. We may briefly mention the religious and liturgical, the performance of rituals, private legal precedents, as well as the aesthetic, didactic and historical, the function of commentary to an esoteric oral record, and what anthropologists call the mythical function. The HE functions and the literary form taken together constitute a valid typology which will enable the historian to make a general evaluation of the probable distortions which his sources may have suffered, while also giving indications concerning the transmission. Taking only those types which remain after this process of selection, We can distinguish names, titles, slogans or mottos, ritual formulae, didactic formulae, proverbs, toponyms, names of persons, genealogies, etc. From their basic form we can classify all these as examples of formulae. Poems, historical, panegyrical, liturgical or ceremonial, religious, personal, lyrical and others, songs of all types, lullabies, working, hunting and canoeing songs, etc. are poems in this sense. The epic poem as a basic form is represented by some poems which do not correspond to what the term normally connotes. Lastly, narrative includes general narrative, whether historical or other, local, family, epic, etiological and aesthetic narratives and personal memories. We shall also include here legal precedents which are rarely transmitted by oral tradition, commentaries on oral records and the occasional notes which are essentially short replies to questions such as, how did we start growing maize, where did this dancer's mask come from, etc. From this list it can immediately be seen what may be the distorting action of an institution on each of these forms. But it must also be shown that such an action actually took place or that the probability of distortion is very great. It is often possible to show that a tradition is valid because it has not suffered the expected distortions. For example, the people says that it is younger than another, a royal chronicle admits a defeat, a particular formula which should explain the physical and human geography of a country no longer conforms to present-day reality. In all these cases analysis shows the validity of the tradition because it has resisted the leveling process. In their work on the phenomenon of writing literacy, Goody and Watt assert that an oral society tends constantly and automatically toward the homeostasis which effaces from the collective memory, hence the expression structural amnesia, any contradiction between the tradition and its social surface. But the cases quoted above show that this homeostasis is only partial. It therefore follows that the historical value of traditions cannot be rejected in bulk merely because they perform certain functions and that each tradition must be subjected to strict sociological criticism. In the same work, these authors assert that the culture of a verbal society is homogenized, that is to say, that the knowledge content of the brain of each adult is approximately the same. This is not entirely true. 150. Oral tradition and its methodology. Craftsmen and political legal and religious specialists know many things of which their contemporaries in the same ethnic group know nothing. Each ethnic group has its thinkers. The MOMG the KUBAs are here, for example. We met three men who, on the basis of the same system of symbols, had worked out three very different philosophies, and we suspect the same is true of the Dogon. With regard to traditions, we find that in very many groups there are secret esoteric traditions, which are the privilege of a restricted group, and public exoteric traditions. For instance, the Asandi royal family knew the secret story about their origin, whereas the general public knew only the official version. In Rwanda, only the Biru specialists knew the royal rituals, and even then they only knew them all when they were all together, since each group of Biru knew only part of them. Secret practices and traditions are found in almost all the historical commemorative festivals in Nigeria, and in almost all the rituals for the enthronement of kings throughout Africa. Does this mean that the esoteric tradition is necessarily more accurate than the exoteric tradition? That depends on the context. After all, esoteric traditions too can be distorted for imperative reasons, which are all the more imperative because the group possessing the secret is a key group in the society. It should be pointed out that in actual fact only a very few esoteric traditions are as yet known to us, because the old order in which they have their roots has not completely disappeared. Those which we do know come from societies which have suffered major upheavals, and many of these traditions will doubtless vanish without leaving the record. However, from the fragments we do possess, we can affirm that certain Ogbanite traditions of the Yoruba country have been so distorted that they no longer constitute a valid message concerning the origins of the Ogbanite, whereas the Biru traditions, for example, seem to be more valid. This is due not to their esoteric character but to their purpose. The former confer legitimacy on the considerable powers possessed by a small group of men, whereas the latter are only reminders of a practical ritual. Each tradition has its own social surface. To find traditions and to analyze the quality of their transmission, the historian must therefore ascertain as far as possible the kind of society he is studying. He must consider all its institutions in order to isolate traditions, just as he will scrutinize all the literary forms for historical information. It is the leading group of a society which retains possession of the official traditions, and their transmission is often carried out by specialists who use mnemotechnical means, often song, to remember the records they have to learn. Sometimes the tradition is checked either by colleagues at private rehearsals or at the public performance which is associated with an important ceremony. The specialists are, however, not always attached to the leading group. This is true in the case of the genealogists, the chiefs or king's drummers, the keepers of the tombs too, and the priests of national religions. But there are also two. In some countries, however, these persons constitute an integral part of the ruling class. For instance, in the case of the Bent Nag, chief of the drums of the Musi. 151. Methodology and African prehistory. Specialists at other levels. The MOMG the Kofar South Africa. There are WOMEN specialized in the art of performing amusing anti-Semi stories. There are also others who know how to do it but do not specialize in it. They usually take part in popular entertainments. Some performers of religious rites are specialists in oral traditions also. The guardians of the Shonamhanda Zimbabwe know the history of the spirits entrusted to their keeping. Some, like the griots, are troubadours, who collect traditions at all levels and perform mutually agreed versions before an appropriate audience on certain occasions, marriage, death, a feast in a chief's residence, and so on. It is rare for there to be no specialization, even at the level of the history of the land or of the family. There are always people who are of a higher social status than bashing the Enta of Burundi for land matters, for example, or WHO are more gifted and WHO are entrusted with memorizing and transmitting traditions. Can he find the category of better informed people? They can hardly be termed specialists, consists of those who live near important historical places. Here the fact of living on the very spot where, for example, the battle was fought, acts as a mnemotechnical aid in the recording of tradition. The examination of the social surface therefore makes it possible to discover existing traditions, to place them in their setting, to find the specialists responsible for them and to study the transmission. This examination also makes it possible to discover valuable indications of the frequency and form of the performances themselves. The HE frequency is an indication of the faithfulness of the transmission. The MOMG, the Dogon Mali, the Syzygy ritual is transmitted only once every 60 years or so. This leads to forgetfulness, and those who have seen to Syzygies and understood enough about what was happening at the first performance to be able to direct the second are very rare. Then no one under the age of 75 can do so. It can be assumed that the content of the Syzygy and the information given will vary more radically than a form of tradition like that of a festival in southern Nigeria which is repeated every year. On the other hand, very frequent performances do not necessarily mean that the transmission is particularly faithful. That depends on the society in question. If it wants a very faithful performance, frequency will help to maintain it. That is the case with magic formulae, for instance, certain formulae to exorcise witchcraft. This explains why some MBOOMs or formulae to ward off rain are placed in such an archaic geographical context that none of the things mentioned can now be found in the present MBOOM country. On the other hand, if the society attaches no importance to the faithfulness of the transmission, very frequent performances will corrupt the transmission more rapidly than less frequent ones would do. Take, for instance, the case of popular songs and especially the best-loved popular narratives. All this can and indeed should be checked by study of the variants collected. Their number is a direct reflection of the faithfulness of the transmission. It would seem that the changes which occur invariably tend to increase. 152. Oral tradition and its methodology. The homeostases between the institution and the accompanying tradition, in this good and what are not entirely wrong. If variants exist and show a well-defined trend, we can deduce that those which are the least in line with the aims and functions of the institution are the most valid. Furthermore, it is sometimes possible to show that a tradition is not to be trusted either where there are no variants, and the tradition has become a stock theme along the lines of we have all come from X, and X corresponds perfectly to the needs of the society, or where, as in popular narrative, the variants are so divergent that it is almost impossible to recognize what constitutes a tradition and separates it from another. In this case, it becomes evident that most of the versions are more or less recent fabrications, based on other popular narratives. In these two extreme cases, however, we must be able to show that the absence of variants really corresponds to a powerful motivation of the society or that their proliferation corresponds to aesthetic considerations or to the need to entertain which override all other considerations, or else we should be able to show that the unconscious assumptions of the culture have so homogenized the tradition that it has become a stock theme without variants. This cultural influence must be examined. The mental framework of tradition. By mental framework we mean the unconscious collective ideas and images of a culture which influence all its forms of expression and at the same time constitute its conception of the world. This mental framework varies from society to society. At a superficial level, it is relatively easy to discover part of this framework by applying the classical techniques of literary criticism to the content of the whole body of the traditions and comparing that body with the other, mainly symbolic, manifestations of the culture. Tradition always idealizes. This is particularly so in the case of poems and narratives. Popular stereotypes are created. All history has a tendency to establish a pattern and consequently to become mythical, whether its content is true or not. Thus we find models of ideal behavior and of values. In royal traditions, stereotyped characters like those in the Western are easy to identify. The king is the magician, another ruler is the just, someone else is the warrior. But this distorts the information. For example, some wars are attributed to the stereotype warrior king when the campaigns were in fact fought by someone else. Moreover, all the kings have COMMOM features which reflect an idealized conception of royalty. It is no more difficult to find stereotypes of different characters, especially leaders, in other societies. There is the ubiquitous one of the culture hero, who turns chaos into a well-ordered society, and the stereotyped notion of chaos is then the description of the world literally upside down. We may find more than one stereotype of the founding heroes. The MOMGPE Nigeria. Some founders are hunters, some are descendants of kings. The former represent achieved. 153. Methodology and African prehistory. Status, the latter hereditary or ascribed status. Reflection explains why there are two types of status. Boston suggested that the first stereotype conceals the accession to power of new groups and that the two stereotypes reflect two quite different historical situations. A wholly satisfactory theory should, however, reveal the entire system of values and ideals linked to the social positions and roles which constitute the very basis of all social action and of every global system. This was not possible until recently when McGaffey discovered that the Congo Zaire, People's Republic of the Congo possess a simple stereotype system of the four ideal positions in society which doctor, soothsayer, chief, prophet which are complementary. It is easy to discover a positive or negative general value, the appreciation of generosity and rejection of jealousy as a sign of witchcraft, or a role of fate. These are values which can immediately be seen in the traditions of the Bight of Benin, as also in the interlacustran area. But the values are discovered one by one and not as a coherent system which includes all the collective ideas and images. For values and ideals describe only the norms of ideal, or sometimes, more cynically, realistic, behavior which should guide the actual behavior and role fulfillment expected of everyone. Roles are linked to social positions and the latter to institutions which, taken together, constitute the society. Theoretically, therefore, a society must be taken to pieces in order to discover its patterns of action, its ideals and its values. Usually, the historian does this unconsciously and superficially. He avoids the obvious traps but unwittingly tends to adopt the assumptions imposed by the system as a whole. He does not succeed in detaching his sources from their environment. We know this very well, having spent 18 years trying to detect connections of this kind in the distortion of traditions of Cuba's Zaire origin. The collective concepts which most influence tradition. There are above all a number of pre-sensual categories. There are those of time, space, historical truth and causality. There are others, such as the division of the spectrum into colors, which are less important. Every people divides time into units, based either on human activities or on recurrent social activities. Structural time. Both forms of time are in use everywhere. Day is separated from night, it is divided into parts corresponding to work for meals and activities are correlated with the height of the sun, the cry of certain animals dividing the hours of the night, and so on. The lunar months, the seasons and the year are usually defined by the environment and its related activities, but beyond that we must count in units of structural time. Even here, the week is determined by a social rhythm, for instance, the periodicity of markets, which is also associated in many cases with a religious periodicity. Periods longer than years are counted by initiation to a cult, to an age group, by reigns or generations. Family history can be calculated by births which form a biological calendar. The reference is made to exceptional events. 154. Oral tradition and its methodology, such as great famines, major outbreaks of animal disease, or epidemics, comets and plagues of locusts, but this calendar of catastrophes is necessarily vague and irregular. At first sight, this sort of computation seems to be of little use for chronology. However, it appears that the use of recurrent events should enable relative chronology to be converted into an absolute chronology, once the frequency of genealogies, age groups, reigns, etc., is known. We shall return to this. The maximum length of time social memory can comprehend depends directly on the institution which is connected with a tradition. Each has its own temporal depth. Family history does not go back far because the extended family covers only 3 generations and there is often little interest in remembering earlier events. Consequently, the institutions which cover the largest number of persons are most likely to go back the farthest in time. This has proved true for the clan, the maximum line of descent, the Maasai-type age group and royalty. In the Sudanese Savannah, the traditions of the kingdoms and empires of Takari, Ghana and Mali, supported by Arab and Sudanese authors, go back to the 11th century. Sometimes, however, all the institutions are limited by the same concept of the depth of time, as for instance among the Tech People's Republic of the Congo where everything is brought forwards to the generation of the father or the grandfather. Everything, including the history of the royal family, is telescoped into odd and even, the odd pertaining to the time of the fathers and the even to that of the grandfathers. This example shows that the notion of the form of time is very important. In the interlacustran region, there are cases where time is thought of as a cycle. But as the cycles succeed each other, the concept becomes that of a spiral. In a different connection, the same societies think in terms of eras, above all the era of chaos and the historical era. Nor is time linear elsewhere, for example among the tech. It oscillates between alternate generations. The consequences for the way in which traditions are presented obvious. It is less obvious that the notion of space is of interest in this context. But there is often a tendency to situate the origin of a people in a place of renown or along a significant axis, the direction being either sacred or profane according to whether it is thought that the end progresses from the sacred to the profane or vice versa. Each people has imposed a system of directions on its geography. It is often the rivers which give the axis of the cardinal directions. Most societies then fix the direction of their villages, sometimes their fields, People's Republic of the Congo along this system of axes, as they do their tombs. The consequences are sometimes unexpected. Where the direction of an area lies along the single axis which is part of the geographical relief, it changes with the relative situation of the various features of that relief. Here downstream is westwards, there it is northwards, here towards the summit is eastwards, there it is westwards. Not only do we find that migration is alleged to have come from privileged directions, as is the case with the Kuba Zaire or the Kaguru Tanzania. 155. Methodology and African prehistory, which turns this particular narrative into a cosmology rather than a history. We even find variations in points of origin depending on accidents of geographical relief. Only societies which use the movements of the sun to determine the axis of space can give exact information concerning general migratory movements, but unfortunately such peoples are in the minority, except perhaps in West Africa where most of the peoples refer to the East as their place of origin. The notion of cause is implicit in every explicit oral historical tradition. It is often presented in the form of a separate, immediate cause for each phenomenon. In that case, each thing has an origin which is situated at the very beginning of time. The nature of causality is often best understood by studying the causes attributed to evil. These are very often directly connected with witchcraft, ancestors, and so on, and the connection is immediate. It follows from this kind of notion of causality that change is perceived mainly in some very clearly defined fields, such as war, royal succession, and so on, where stereotypes intervene. It should be noted finally that this sketch of the notion of cause is very summary and must be supplemented by other notions of cause which are more complex though parallel, and which affect only minor social institutions. As for historical truth, it is always very closely connected with the fidelity of the oral record transmitted. Thus it can mean either the consensus of the ruler's idioma, Nigeria, or the recognition that the tradition is in conformity with what the preceding generation said. The cognitive categories combine and join with symbolic expressions of values to produce a record which the anthropologists speak of as a myth. The traditions most subject to a mythical restructuring are those which describe the origin, and consequently the essence, of a people, its reason for existence. Thus a large number of complex Cuban narratives describing their origin and migrations in canoes have finally been explained thanks to the discovery of a latent concept of migration, for the Cuba people migrate in canoes from downstream sacred to upstream profane. Similarly, many names of migrations and areas of origin have been explained in terms of cosmogony. In the Cuban narrative the idea was not obvious, whereas in the case of many other ethnic groups the correlation is quite clear. This is how many ethnologists, unfortunately following the example of Beethoven, the structuralists or the functionalist sociologists, have ended up by denying that any narrative traditions have any value, because, they say, they are all expressions of the cognitive structures of the world, which underlie all thought a priori, like imperative categories. The same judgment should then apply to the text you are reading or to that of Beethoven himself. Obviously, these anthropologists exaggerate. Moreover, many of their interpretations seem to be very hypothetical. The historian should remember that for each particular case, he must state the reasons there are for rejecting or questioning a tradition, and so he must look for these reasons. A tradition can be rejected only when the probability of its having been created. 156. Oral tradition and its methodology. To convey the purely symbolic meaning is really strong and provable. For, in general, traditions reflect both a myth, in the anthropological sense of the term, and historical information. In such circumstances, historical manuals are mythological texts, since every stereotype originating in a system of values and interests is not only a mythical message but also a historical cipher awaiting decoding. Chronology. If there is no chronology, there is no history, because it is no longer possible to distinguish what preceded from what follows. Oral tradition always gives a relative chronology, expressed in lists for generations. In general, this chronology enables the whole body of traditions of the society under study to be placed in the framework of the genealogy or the list of kings or age groups, which covers the broadest geographical area, but it does not enable the relative sequence of events to be linked to those outside the particular region. Important historical movements and even some local evolutions go unnoticed or remain doubtful because the unit on which the chronology is calculated is geographically too restricted. Family genealogy is valid only for the one family and the village or villages it lives in. For example, the chronology of the MBU is based on age groups which cover only a minute territorial area in which the young and are initiated at the same time. Relative chronologies must therefore be linked together and if possible converted into absolute chronologies. But first there is another problem to be solved, that of ensuring that the information used corresponds to a reality which has not been distorted with respect to time. It is becoming increasingly clear that oral chronology is subject to distortion acting into opposite directions. Sometimes it shortens and sometimes prolongs the true duration of past events. There is also a tendency to regularize genealogies, successions and sequences of age groups, to make them conform to the current ideal norms of society. Otherwise, the information would furnish precedents for all sorts of legal disputes. The homeostatic process is very real. In certain special cases, for example in Rwanda, the task of regulating tradition falls upon a complex group of specialists whose statements have been borne out by archaeological excavations. Ethnologists have shown that so-called segmentary societies tend to eliminate useless ancestors, that is to say, those who have not left descendants who still live as a separate group. This explains why the genealogical depth of each group in a given society tends to remain constant. Only the useful ancestors are used to explain the present. This sometimes leads to a very considerable telescoping of the genealogical depth. Furthermore, demographical accidents sometimes reduce a branch of descendants to such a small number, in comparison with the other branches descended from the brothers and sisters of the founder of the first branch. 157. Methodology and African prehistory. That it cannot any longer exist in parallel with the large neighboring groups and so is absorbed by one of them. The genealogy will be readjusted and the founder of the diminishing group gives place to the founder of the larger absorbing group. The HE genealogy is thus simplified. The HE identity of an ethnic group is often expressed by a single ancestor placed at the beginning of a genealogy. This is the first man, the founding hero, etc. This will be the father or mother of the first useful ancestor. In this way, the gap between origin and conscious history is abolished. Unfortunately, this process has very often led to a situation in which it is practically impossible to go back with any confidence further than a few generations before the present. It used to be thought that many African societies, and especially the monarchies, had escaped this process. There was no reason why the list of succession of the kings should not be correct, or why their genealogy should be doubtful, except that it was sometimes falsified when one dynasty replaced another and took over the genealogy of its predecessor in order to legitimize itself. The HE number of kings and generations, however, was apparently still correct. Recent detailed studies show that this position may not be entirely justified. The HE processes of telescoping, lengthening and regularizing may affect dynastic traditions as much as others. In king lists, for example, the names of usurpers, that is to say, those who are considered, at present or at any time after their reign, to be usurpers, are sometimes omitted, and so white kings who have not undergone all the initiation ceremonies, which are sometimes very long. The HE reign of a king who abdicates and later returns to power is sometimes counted as a single reign. All this dislocates the historical process. Where succession is patrilineal and primogenital, as in the interlacustran region, the tendency to regularize the facts has resulted in a surprising number of regular successions, i.e. son succeeding father, which are much greater than the average, or even the record, for other parts of the world. This regularization process produces a typical direct line genealogy from the earliest times up to about the 19th century, at which point it branches out laterally. The result is to lengthen the dynasty by increasing the number of generations, since collaterals are shown as fathers and sons. Confusion between people of the same name and between the regnal or titular name and the personal name, as well as other details of this kind, can lengthen or shorten the list. During colonial times, especially in regions under indirect rule, the pressure to lengthen the dynasties was strong because, since European, like so many African, societies have a great respect for antiquity, every ambiguous device and every possible means was used to lengthen the dynasties. All possible names were then used, which were repeated if necessary with the addition of cycles of royal names, and collateral branches were proved in order to lengthen the trunk. Lastly, and always where kingdoms are concerned, there is often a gap between the founding hero, who belongs to cosmogony, and the first historically useful king. Only a very careful investigation can determine. 158. Oral tradition and its methodology. Whether or not the processes described actually took place. The presence of irregularities in the succession and in the genealogy is often the best guarantee of authenticity, because they show a resistance to homeostatic leveling. Age group societies have not yet been subjected to this kind of systematic examination. Some cases show that regularization processes are at work to make cycles more orderly or to reduce the confusion produced by people having the same names. But the different kinds of age group succession have still to be studied. We cannot generalize, except to say that the problem raised is similar to that of the genealogies, because generations are still the unit. A thorough statistical study, which provided much of the information referred to above, shows that the average length of a dynastic generation is between 26 and 32 years. The sample was mainly patrilineal, but matrilineal dynasties are not, for example, grouped in the lower segment of the statistical distribution, and the information would be valid for them also. The average length of reign varies so greatly with the system of succession that no generally valid information can be provided. Even in the case of identical types of succession, considerable divergencies are found between different dynasties. On the basis of the above information, the relative chronology of generations can be converted into an absolute chronology unless the genealogical distortion is such as would make the exercise futile. The average between the first absolute chronological reference provided by written date and the present is first calculated, and that average is projected into the past if it lies between 26 and 32 years. Averages are, however, only averages. Their probability increases with the number of generations concerned, and the calculation provides reasonable dates only for the beginnings of sequences, or at best, say, once a century. Any greater precision leads to error. In any case, absolute dates calculated in this way must be preceded by a sigma to indicate the fact. Thus ±1635 for the foundation of the kingdom would indicate that the date was calculated on the basis of genealogies and king lists. The same procedure can be applied to determine the average length of a reign. It has been shown why this average is less valid than that relating to generations. One of the reasons is that, when the average is projected back into the past, it is assumed that there was no change in the systems of succession. Yet they could have changed over the years. In fact, they probably changed at the time of the founding of a dynasty, because to found is to innovate, and the succession no doubt took a certain time to become standardized. In addition, account must be taken of changes which may have occurred in the life expectation. Since the margin of error is greater, it follows that it will be particularly useful to possess absolute dates, determined by written documents or by some other means going back as far as possible into the past. However, continuing in the field of relative chronology, it is possible to try. 159. Methodology and African prehistory. To coordinate separate neighboring different related sequences by studying synchronisms. The battle between two named kings provides a synchronism. It makes it possible to harmonize the two relative chronologies in question and to combine them into one. It has been shown empirically that synchronisms between more than 3 isolated units are no longer valid. It may be shown that A and B lived at the same time, or that A and C lived at the same time because both met B, therefore B equals C, but we can go no further. The fact that A's and C's meetings with B might have occurred at any time during B's active life explains why E=C is the limit. In practice, research on the chronology of the ancient Middle East has proved this point. Nevertheless, with a prudent use of synchronisms, reasonably large single fields which possess a COMMON relative chronology can be reconstructed. After the genealogical data have been examined, an absolute date can be obtained if the tradition mentions an eclipse of the sun. If there is more than one possible date for the eclipse, it must be shown which is the most probable. We can proceed in the same way with other astronomical phenomena or extraordinary climatic phenomena which cause disasters. There is less certainty here than for eclipses of the sun because there are, for example, more famines in East Africa than eclipses of the sun. With the exception of eclipses of the sun, other information of this kind is mainly useful for the last 2 centuries. Even so, few peoples have preserved the memory of much earlier eclipses. Evaluation of oral traditions. Once sources have been subjected to thorough literary and sociological criticism, they can be assigned a degree of probability. This appraisal cannot be quantified, but it is nonetheless real. A tradition's accuracy will be greatly increased if the information it contains can be checked against that given in other independent traditions or from other sources. Independent sources which agree transform the probability into something approaching a certainty. But the independence of the sources must be proved. Unfortunately, however, there has been too great a tendency to believe in the purity and watertight quality of transmission from one ethnic group to another. In practice, caravans of merchants such as the Mbangala of Angola, or no doubt those of the Daula and the Hausa, may bring with them fragments of history which are incorporated into local history because they fit in well. Later on, links were formed between representatives of different groups at the beginning of the colonial period and they exchanged information concerning their traditions. This is strikingly the case for regions under indirect rule, where practical considerations encouraged kingdoms, in particular, to produce their histories. Moreover, all such histories have been influenced by the first histories written by Africans, such as Johnson's book on the Oyo Kingdom Nigeria or that of Kawa Uganda for the Buganda. There followed a general contamination of 160. Oral tradition and its methodology. All the histories put into written form subsequently in the Yoruba country and the English-speaking interlacustran region, with attempts at synchronization in order to make dynastic lists at least as long as those of the models. These 2 examples show how careful one must be before stating that traditions are really independent. Archives must be searched, pre-colonial contacts studied and everything carefully weighed before any judgment can be made. Comparison with written or archaeological data may provide the desired independent confirmation. Here again, the independence must be proved. And the local inhabitants traditionally attribute a visible site to the first inhabitants of the country because there are evident traces of human habitation which are very different from those left by the people currently living there. That does not mean that the site can automatically be attributed to those first inhabitants. The sources are not independent because the site is attributed to those inhabitants' biological process and a pridal it is a case of iconatrophy and gives rise to interesting conjectures, especially concerning the so-called Telern remains in the Dodon country Mali and the Sirikwa sites Kenya. To mention only 2 famous examples. Nonetheless, the famous sites of Koumbi Saleh Mauritania and at Lake Kisale Zaire show that archaeology can sometimes supply striking proof of the validity of an oral tradition. It is often difficult to establish a concordance between an oral and a written source, because these 2 sources speak of different things. The foreigner writing about a country usually restricts himself to economic and political facts, which are often still incompletely understood. The oral source, which is inward-looking, mentions foreigners only casually, if at all. Hence in many cases the 2 have nothing in common, even if they do relate to the same period. Cases of concordance, above all chronological concordance, are found where foreigners have been settled in the country for long enough to become interested in local politics and to understand them. The Senegal Valley has been an example of this since the 17th century. In cases of contradiction between oral sources, the most probable should be chosen. The widespread practice of trying to find a compromise often makes no sense at all. A flagrant contradiction between an oral and an archaeological source is resolved in favor of the latter if it is an immediate datum, that is to say, if the source is an object and not an inference, in which latter case the probability of the oral source can be greater. A conflict between the written and an oral source is resolved exactly as if they were two oral sources. It will be borne in mind that written quantitative information is often more reliable, but that oral information concerning motives is often more accurate than that from written sources. Finally, the historian tries to establish what is most probable. In an extreme case, if only one oral source is available, if it has been proved likely to have suffered distortion, it must be interpreted and used with due regard for the probable extent of the distortion. 161. Methodology and African prehistory. Finally, the historian often does not feel satisfied with his oral information. He may note that he does not believe it to be really valid, but, for lack of anything better, he is bound to use it so long as other sources have not been discovered. Collection and publication. It follows from all that has been said above that all the elements which enable traditions to be subjected to historical criticism must be collected in the field. This calls for a good knowledge of the culture, the society and the language or languages involved. The historian may acquire this knowledge himself, or he may enlist the help of specialists. But even so, he must himself absorb all the information offered by the ethnologist, the linguist and the translators who are helping him. Lastly, he must adopt a systematic attitude to the sources, all the variants of which must be collected. All this implies long residence in the field, and this stay will be all the longer if the historian is not very familiar with the culture in question. It must be pointed out that the instinctive knowledge acquired by someone who studies the history of his OWM society is not enough. Sociological reflection is indispensable. The historian must rediscover his own culture. Linguistic experience has shown that sometimes even the MN who is a native of the country does not easily understand certain oral records, such as panegyrical poems, or finds himself in difficulties because people speak a dialect different from his own. Furthermore, it is advisable that at least part of the transcriptions made in his mother dialect should be checked by a linguist to ensure that the transcription includes all the signs necessary to the understanding of the account, including, for example, the tones. The collection of traditions therefore requires much time and patience and much thought. After an initial trial period, a well-thought-out plan of campaign must be worked out, taking into account the special features of each case. In any event, the sites associated with the historical processes being studied must be visited. Sometimes it will be necessary to use a sampling of popular sources, but samples cannot be used haphazardly. The rules which determine the birth of variants should be studied in a limited area, and the principles of the sampling to be done established on the basis of these rules. To collect a vast amount of material indiscriminately cannot produce the same result, even if the work is done more quickly. The researcher must take care to examine the ways in which traditions have been transmitted. It is increasingly common to meet informants who have acquired their knowledge from published work on the history of the region, textbooks, newspapers or scientific publications, just as the wife from lectures on the radio or on television. The danger will inevitably become more acute with the proliferation of research. It is now being realized that there is also a more subtle contamination. Occasionally very old, manuscripts and above all reports from the 162. Oral tradition and its methodology. Early days of colonial administration have been taken over by tradition as ancestral truths. Archival sources must therefore be checked, as well as the possible influence of scientific works, textbooks, radio broadcasts, and so on. For if the fact is noted in the field, these insidious contributions may often be corrected by looking for other versions and by explaining to the informants that the book or the radio is not necessarily right in such matters. Once away from the field, however, it is too late. Research must be planned with a clear historical idea in view. It is never possible to collect all the traditions, and any attempt to do so would produce only a confused mass of information. It is first necessary to decide on the historical problems to be studied and then to look for sources to illuminate them. In order to formulate the problems, it is obvious that the researcher must have absorbed the culture in question. He may then, as is most often the case, decide to pursue the study of its political history. But he can also choose its social, economic, religious, cultural or artistic history, etc. And in each case the strategy used in collecting the tradition will be different. The greatest deficiency in present-day research is the lack of historical awareness. There is too great a tendency to be guided by what one finds. Lack of patience is another danger. There is a wish to cover as much ground as possible as quickly as possible. In such circumstances, the sources collected are difficult to evaluate, they remain disparate and incomplete. The HE variants are missing. There is little information about the transformation of a source, its shape and its transmission. The HE work is badly done. A particularly harmful effect is the impression created among other researchers that this area has already been studied, which lessens the likelihood of better research being done in the future. It should not be forgotten that oral traditions disappear, though happily less quickly than is generally thought. The HE urgency of the task is no reason for scamping it. It may be and has been said that what we are advocating here is utopian, the counsel of perfection, impossible. Nonetheless, it is the only way of doing good work with the means available and the time available. There are no shortcuts. If we find that, in some cases, all this work produces only a very meager harvest for history, we overlook the fact that at the same time the general knowledge of the language, literature, collective thought and social structures of the civilization studied has been enriched. Unless it is published, the work is not complete, because it has not been made available to the world of scholars. At least the classification of the sources investigated should be envisaged, with an introduction, notes and an index in order to constitute a body of archives open to all. This work is often combined with the publication of a study based partly or wholly on this corpus of material. Then the publisher would publish all the material, including the variants and the interpretation of the information. Besides, it is not advisable for a synthesis to be submerged in a vast mass of unprocessed evidence. But each word will explain how the traditions were collected and will give a brief list of the sources and informants, which will enable the 163. Methodology and African Prehistory reader to form an opinion on the quality of the collection and to understand why the author chose one source rather than another. For the same reason, each oral source should be quoted separately in the work. The HE work which says tradition has it that makes a dangerous generalization. There remains a specialized type of publication, editions of texts. Here the same standards are followed as for the publication of manuscripts. In practice, this often leads to collaboration between various specialists. Not everyone is at the same time a historian, a linguist and an etymologist. In fact, the best published texts available to date are nearly all the joint work of two collaborators, at least one of whom is a linguist. The HE publication of texts is a hard, unrewarding task, which explains why there are so few of them. However, their number is increasing with the help of specialists in African oral literature.